Welcome to Better Gaming. Today we are venturing into a hidden realm inside your game console, a place where kernels, rules and hypervisors lurk. If those words sound like jargon now, stick around. By the end of this video, you will not only know what kernels and hypervisors are in both software and hardware terms, but you will understand why PlayStation 5 acts like Fort Knox while a Nintendo Switch feels more like a modest safe. We'll unravel how jailbreaks and custom firmware actually work under the hood, all in beginner-friendly terms. No fluff, just a fascinating, almost psychological battle between hackers and the machines. Get ready for the tech documentary crash course that will leave you feeling insanely satisfied with your new knowledge. What is a kernel? Understanding the king of the system. Think of the kernel as the core of an operating system, the brain of your console software. It's like the king in a kingdom or the city's mayor controlling everything that happens. The kernel talks directly to the hardware like the CPU, memory and controllers, and also manages what every app or game can or cannot do. In more technical terms, the kernel operates in a privileged mode, often called kernel mode, with full access to the system's resources. It decides which program runs when, manages memory and enforces security restrictions for games or apps running in user mode, less privileged. Without a kernel, your console or any computer is chaos. Nothing knows how to use anything without it. But here is the key: because the kernel is so powerful, it's the prime target for hackers. If you can get root or kernel access, you basically become the king. You can modify how the system works at a fundamental level. This is exactly what console modders and jailbreakers aim for. Take control away from the vendor's kernel and make it do their bidding. Remember this: kernel equals ultimate control. When you hear that a jailbreak got kernel exploit, it means the hackers found a way to make the kernel do something unintended, handing them the keys to the kingdom. Hardware and software, where the kernel lives. Now, in terms of hardware, the kernel isn't a physical thing you can touch. It lives as code running on the main processor. In a Nintendo Switch, for example, the kernel is part of the Switch operating system called Horizon, running on the NVIDIA Tegra X1 chip. On a PlayStation 5, the kernel is part of its custom operating system, derived from FreeBSD, running on the AMD CPU. These kernels live in special memory regions, and the hardware, the CPU, has features to protect that memory. Modern CPUs have different privileged levels or rings, like Ring 0 for kernel in PCs, to enforce that users' programs can't just tamper with kernel memory. On ARM-based devices like the Switch, they have what's called exception levels, EL0 for normal apps, EL1 for the kernel. The hardware knows which code is running in which level and restricts instructions accordingly. So the kernel power is also a vulnerability if anything at EL0, which is the user level, can trick its way into executing at EL1, the kernel level. Boom, you've got a kernel exploit. Meet the hypervisor, the boss of bosses. So, if the kernel is king, what's a hypervisor? It sounds like hypervisor, an ultra supervisor, and that's pretty much it. The hypervisor is like an emperor above the king.
I'm the king of kings!
A layer of software and the hardware support that can oversee one or more kernels. In typical computing, hypervisors are used for virtualizations, allowing one machine to run multiple operating systems in separate virtual machines. Think of cloud servers running many virtual servers. That's a hypervisor in action, allocating resources and keeping each virtual machine separate. But consoles aren't trying to run multiple operating systems for users, right? They just run one game OS. So why would something like the PlayStation 5 include hypervisor? The answer: security. On the PlayStation 5, the hypervisor is a custom-built layer that runs at an even higher privilege than the kernel. You can consider it ring -1 in PC terms or EL2 in ARM terms.
I'm king. Right.
Its purpose is to monitor and restrict the kernel itself. Essentially, Sony uses a hypervisor for virtualization-based security, VBS, meaning the PlayStation 5 kernel and games run in sort of contained guest environment, while the hypervisor, the host, checks certain operations. If the kernel tried to do something sneaky, like modifying critical system code or turning off protections, the hypervisor can intervene. It is like the kernel has a probation officer. Now, the hypervisor has the highest privilege on the PlayStation 5 CPU. Even hardware devices and the kernel have to request certain actions via hypercalls, special calls to the hypervisor. For example, on PlayStation 5, the hypervisor controls memory mapping. It uses features like nested pages tables, a second layer of memory translation, so that even if the kernel tries to access memory, the hypervisor can enforce extra rules. It also protects critical CPU settings, control registers from being changed. All this makes the PlayStation 5 kernel effectively read-only and locked down in crucial ways. In short, the hypervisor is a bodyguard above the kernel kernel, a built-in virtual machine monitor whose only job is to keep the kernel honest and secure. On the PlayStation 5, you can imagine that even if a hacker gets into the kernel, they find themselves in a smaller cage.
But I'm the king!
Powerful, but not absolute, because the hypervisor is still limiting what the compromised kernel can do. Nintendo Switch, TrustZone and the missing hypervisor. Now, here's the twist. The Nintendo Switch, which uses an NVIDIA Tegra ARM chip, does have the capacity for a hypervisor, ARM's EL2 level, but Nintendo doesn't actually use it for the Switch's normal operation. On the Switch, the security model is a bit different. Instead of a hypervisor, it leans heavily on something called ARM TrustZone, and the Switch was Nintendo's first device to use it. TrustZone is a hardware feature that splits the world into two: a secure world, EL3 on ARM, and a normal world, EL0 to EL2 for normal stuff. The Switch's operating system, Horizon, runs in normal world at EL1 kernel and apps at EL0, but certain critical tasks run in secure world. The secure world is like a vault where sensitive operations happen. On the Switch's cryptography, like decryption of games, key management, and some system management like power states, are handled by the secure monitor in EL3. Now, the secure monitor is basically code that runs with TrustZone privileges. When the normal OS needs to do a secure operation, it performs an SMC secure monitor call, like asking the vault keeper to do something and return the result. So why not use the hypervisor on Switch? Possibly because Nintendo's design didn't require running multiple OS, or they felt TrustZone was enough. The Tegra X1 does support EL2, and interestingly, the homebrew community noticed that the Switch OS left EL2 unused, which means in theory, a hacker who gains full control of the system could install their own hypervisor there. In fact, the popular custom firmware Atmosphere does something along these lines. It uses high privileges to set up custom systems, though still largely operating at the kernel level. But out of the factory, Switch is essentially using TrustZone EL3 as the high security layer, and there's no hypervisor actively supervising the Switch's kernel. And the consequences? Once you break the Switch's kernel and the TrustZone secure monitor, you're basically fully in control. There's no additional hypervisor safety net. We will see in a moment how that played out for hackers. Console Security 101, Chain of Trust and Hardware Roots. Now, before we dive into how jailbreaks exploit these differences, we need to mention one more foundational concept: the hardware root of trust. Both Sony and Nintendo designed their consoles such that at power on, a series of checks occurs, a chain of trust. At the very start is the root of trust, usually an unmodifiable piece of code in read-only memory, the boot ROM, and some secret keys burned into the hardware fuses of the chip. Think of it as a secret master key fused into the CPU. Concentration now. When you press power on the console's processor, first runs code from its boot ROM, cannot be changed or updated, which then checks the next stage bootloader for a valid digital signature using those burned-in keys. If the signature is valid, meaning the code is official and untempered, it proceeds to that next stage, which then checks the next and so forth. This is the chain of trust. It's like a ladder, each step is verified by the previous step's approval. This hardware root of trust is why, under normal circumstances, you can't just load a custom firmware. The boot ROM won't recognize it as valid and will stop the boot. It's also why console hacks are so challenging. You're trying to break a chain that has been mathematically locked down with cryptography. For the Switch, the combination of the Tegra X1's boot ROM and the fuses constitutes that root of trust. And for the PlayStation 5, the concept is very similar. Sony has secure bootloaders and likely an equivalent in their hardware. Now, hypervisors and trust zones came into play after those initial boot stages. They assume that the system booted legitimate code and now their job is to maintain security during operation. But if hackers can exploit something before the security layers fully engage, they can sometimes break into the system despite the chain of trust. Keep that in mind. It's exactly how the Switch was first cracked open. If you didn't understand it yet, now I hope you understand it. Hackers usually follow a general strategy to jailbreak consoles. Start at the edges and work inward. The edges are the less privileged parts of the system, like an app or a game or a web browser running in user mode. They look for a vulnerability there. Maybe a game that reads files from an SD card without proper checks, or a web browser bug. The Switch's early userland exploit often came via the hidden WebKit based browser. Once they get some code running in userland, EL0, the next step is to escalate privileges. Find a flaw that lets that code break into kernel EL1 level. This might be a bug in the OS kernel itself or a driver, and if successful, they now have kernel control. On many devices, kernel control equals victory for custom firmware, but as we learned on a system like PlayStation 5,
no, I'm not the king.
The hypervisor means kernel control is not the final boss. On devices with something like TrustZone, which is the Switch, the hackers might need to also break into the secure world to dump encryption keys or disable protections on devices with a hypervisor, PlayStation 5. Hackers then have to tackle the hypervisor as an additional boss fight. It's like beating the final boss in a game only to realize there's a secret true final boss. Another angle is to skip straight to the deepest layer, the boot ROM or firmware. This is what happened famously with the Nintendo Switch around 2018. Hackers found an unpatchable bug in the Switch's NVIDIA Tegra boot ROM, the exploit called Fusey. It allowed arbitrary code execution at the very start of boot, effectively bypassing the entire chain of trust. The moment that bug became public, every original Switch unit became jailbreakable for life, because the root of trust was compromised. So, like we learned before, with that, hackers could run their own code before the system turned on any security, meaning they could load custom firmware into the kernel and even have TrustZone under their control. In our Kingdom analogy, that was like finding a secret door into the castle keep, bypassing all the guards. So, mission passed. On the PlayStation 5, no such easy low-hanging fruit has emerged, at least not publicly as of 2025. Instead, what we have seen are carefully chained exploits, for instance a WebKit browser exploit userland combined with a kernel exploit for certain older PlayStation 5 firmware allowed modders to get kernel execution on PlayStation 5. However, they still found themselves in a guest prison of the Hypervisor. The PS5's Hypervisor made sure that even with kernel access, certain things like disabling signatures checks or extracting keys remained difficult. That's why, even after those exploits, the PlayStation 5 wasn't fully jailbroken in the sense of being able to install custom firmware freely. As one security researcher, SpectreDev, pointed out, the Hypervisor is the holy grail. Until you crack that, the system isn't wide open. PlayStation 5 versus Switch. Why one is hard mode for hackers? Let's put this all together with our two case studies, the PlayStation 5 and the Nintendo Switch. We'll touch on the Switch successor too in a moment. Nintendo Switch. It runs a custom OS without a hypervisor, relying on TrustZone for critical security. Early in its life, hackers lucked out by finding that Tegra boot ROM bug, essentially winning the war in one shot. Even before that, there were software exploits. People found holes in games like Pokemon Quest, believe it or not, and the browser to get userland code and even smoke kernel exploits on very early firmware. But Nintendo's patch cycles was outpaced by that one big hardware flaw. With kernel access, homebrew developers were able to dump the Switch secrets like cryptographic keys stored in that TrustZone secure monitor. Once they had TrustZone code execution, they could even bootstrap a custom hypervisor in EL2 if they wanted. Basically do things the console itself never did. So custom firmware like Atmosphere effectively replaces portions of the Horizon OS, disables signature checks so unsigned apps can run, and lets users mod the system extensively. The Switch became a homebrew heaven because its security had a single point of failure that got exposed. No hypervisor meant no extra commitment beyond the secure monitor, and the secure monitor was bypassed when the boot ROM fell. It's worth noting, Nintendo did try to respond with hardware revisions. Later, Switch models like Mariko units and the OLED model have a fixed boot ROM, so Fusey doesn't work on them. Hackers then adapted by using mod chips that glitch the hardware to similarly take over early in boot, an attack called voltage glitching. The cat and mouse continued, but essentially once you have that early code execution, the lack of a hypervisor means you fully control the system. The only real persistent barrier becomes the signature verification and keys, which, if you bypass at boot each time, you bypass for the session. PlayStation 5. Sony learned from previous generations. PlayStation 3 was hacked via other OS/hypervisor exploit. PlayStation 4 eventually got kernel exploits. The PlayStation 5's architecture with its hypervisor is like an onion with an extra layer. Even if you peel the outer layer, userland, and the next kernel, there's one more skin keeping the innards protected. Real world effect. The PlayStation 5 scene has seen kernel exploits, for example on firmware 4.03 and 4.50. There were public exploits that gave some level of kernel access for homebrew on those specific versions. But those did not allow custom firmware installation. You had to stay within a sandbox. Why? The hypervisor was still enforcing things like execute only memory, XOM, and preventing certain kernel patches. Hackers have to either find a way to disable or escape the hypervisor, or find flaws in how the hypervisor works. And indeed, in late 2023 and 2024, security researchers like SpectreDev finally demonstrated exploits in the PlayStation 5 hypervisor on older firmware, nicknamed Hypervisor. These exploits took advantage of subtle implementation flaws and could break out of the virtual machine cage on those firmware, effectively giving full control kernel plus hypervisor. This was a huge breakthrough because it meant, at least in theory, true custom firmware could run on those PlayStation 5s, but crucially, Sony patched those vulnerabilities in newer updates. Because the hypervisor is so integral, Sony was quick to fix and likely improved it. The hypervisor is small on purpose, smaller code, fewer bugs. So far, the PlayStation 5 hasn't seen a public release of anything like a full custom firmware for current firmware. It's a moving target, and from the look of it, that extra layer has significantly slowed down the hacking community. It might take years or a lucky break to fully jailbreak a PlayStation 5, if ever. Peek at the next generation switch to security. Now, let's talk about the future, Nintendo's next console, the Switch 2. Nintendo clearly tried to build on the lessons from the first Switch. Reports from the first week of Switch 2's launch showed that Nintendo's implemented an even more robust secure boot process and likely a more custom system on chip to avoid known exploits. Early hackers who poked at it found that most of their attempts were immediately shut down, often resulting in the console's bricking, basically locking up as soon as an exploit was attempted. This suggests very aggressive security, possibly hardware circuits that detect tampering or glitch attempts. One rumor said even slight voltage changes would shut it down, a countermeasure against the glitching attacks used on the original Switch. Interestingly, within about a day of Switch 2's release, a known hacker did manage to get a userland exploit running using a web browser vulnerability, but it was strictly in user mode. Now you know what it is. They showed custom graphics on the screen using a technique called ROP, return-oriented programming, which is a fancy way to execute code without native code execution rights. However, that exploit did not touch the kernel and could not persist or do anything beyond a fun demo. The hacker themselves said it has no practical purpose for now. It's not a jailbreak, just a foothold. And crucially, it didn't compromise the Switch 2's kernel or security features. And what this tells us is that Nintendo's likely added either a hypervisor or stronger isolation in the Switch 2's design. The Switch 2 still uses ARM architecture, which means TrustZone is certainly there, and given modern ARM chips, an AL2 hypervisor mode may well be utilized this time. We don't have official confirmation, but the trend is that consoles are converging on the idea of multi-layer security, a secure boot chain with a hardware root of trust, fuses encrypted firmware, an OS kernel with minimal privileges given to games, and either a hypervisor or secure monitor that the kernel cannot bypass easily. Early speculations from respected console hackers indicated it might be years before a meaningful exploit is found on the Switch 2, since no obvious holes were open and any mistake led to a crash or break. As one article put it will likely take weeks, months, or even years before someone discovers a way to defeat the built-in protections of the new device. So if you're used to the wild homebrew scene of the Switch 1, brace yourself. Switch 2 could be a much tougher nut to crack by design. Why knowing this makes you smarter and safer. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, cool tech stuff, but why should I care about kernels and hypervisors as a gamer? Understanding these concepts gives you insight into why consoles are so locked down and how jailbreaks work without needing a step-by-step tutorial. When someone says, we achieved code execution at the kernel level on a console, you now know that's huge. It means
you see, I did see.
If they say, but we're still in a hypervisor VM, you get that there's an emperor still above guarding the realm. And this knowledge also helps you appreciate the risks. Installing a custom firmware isn't just flipping a magic switch. It's literally telling the device to ignore its built-in security, which can be dangerous. If done wrong, you can break your device or expose it to malicious code. For example, on the Switch, once you disable signature checks, you become responsible for what runs on your system. And not everything out there is friendly, don't forget that. On the PlayStation 5, if someone ever distributes a hypervisor hack, you would want to be sure it's from a very trusted source, because that's like handing someone the master key to your console. Now for the curious minds and body techies, learning about kernel and hypervisor is empowering. These aren't just abstract terms, they are tools you can visualize. Picture a kernel as the core engine of your device software and the hypervisor as a safety framework around that engine. When you jailbreak, you're essentially tinkering with the engine and sometimes even remove the safety framework. So yeah, it's pretty wild stuff, and you should feel a bit like a tech secret agent for grasping it. A quick history detour consoles hacking analogies. To make sure this really sinks in, let's very briefly analogize with a bit of console history. PlayStation 3. This older Sony console actually had a hypervisor for its other OS feature, which let you install Linux. Hackers like George Hotz, Geo Hot, found ways to glitch the hypervisor through the other OS Linux access, and eventually extracted the system's root keys. Once those keys were out, Sony security was effectively nullified, and custom firmware galore followed. It was a big lesson. Don't let the public run code even in a sandbox hypervisor if there's any crack in it. Sony removed other OS and doubled down on security thereafter. Xbox 360. Microsoft's 360 also had a form of hypervisor in its architecture. The first big hack on the 360 was actually exploiting a bug in that hypervisor, the famous King Kong shader hack. A specific game demo disk call triggered an error that gave hackers hypervisor level access. That again shows break the hypervisor and the console is yours. PlayStation 4. The PS4 didn't have a hypervisor, but it had layers, user, kernel, plus some integrity monitors. Over years, hackers found multiple web and kernel exploits, and by the end of its cycle, jailbreaking a PlayStation 4 on older firmware became straightforward. You run a web exploit, gain kernel, and then you're free to install Linux or a hobbyist firmware in memory. Sony mitigated via firmware updates, but it was a bit of a whack-a-mole. The PlayStation 5's introduction of a hypervisor was a direct answer to that, adding a systematic hurdle rather than just hoping no kernel bugs are present. These stories show a pattern. Consoles started with a relatively simple security, got broken, and then manufacturers added more complex layers like hypervisors, secure enclaves to stay ahead. It's an arms race. As an enthusiast, following this cat and mouse game can be thrilling and also educational. It's like watching master locksmiths and lockpickers, except the locks are cryptographic and the picks are code. Conclusion: empowerment through understanding. By now, terms like kernel, hypervisor, TrustZone, secure boot, and custom firmware should no longer sound like sci-fi gibberish. You should be picturing something: the kernel as the core program that consoles and all computers run to manage everything, the hypervisor as a special guardian layer that only some systems have, mainly to enforce security, and mechanisms like hardware, root of trust that underlie it all. You have also seen how different design choices, PlayStation 5's hypervisor versus Switch's TrustZone approach, led to very different outcomes in the cat and mouse game of console hacking. Most importantly, you've gained a beginner-friendly but technically accurate insight into what's happening when you or someone else jailbreaks a device. It's not magic, it's a battle of wits against very sophisticated security design. And now you're in those secrets. The next time you see a headline like hackers achieve kernel exploit on XYZ console, you will know exactly why that's significant and what hurdles remain. I mean, knowledge like this widens your perspective. Maybe it even inspires you to learn more about cybersecurity, operating systems, or to tinker legally and responsibly, hopefully, with hardware you own. At the very least, you can wow your friends by explaining that the PlayStation 5 hasn't been fully hacked yet because of a thing called the hypervisor that basically acts like an immune system for the console's OS. That's a pretty cool conversation at a gaming meetup, right? Alright guys, thank you for watching this deep dive on kernels and hypervisors in console land. Oh man, my voice is gone. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe to Better Gaming for more fast, no fluff tech explainers. Remember, learning how things work under the hood makes you a better gamer and a smarter tech user. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to smile. My name is Yu. Peace.